The courthouse bell struck 9 times through the brittle December air, each clang echoing off the frost-covered buildings of Cedar Ridge. Martha Kellaway stood in the center of the town square, her breath forming small white clouds as she watched the townspeople gather in a loose circle around her. Their faces carried the weight of fear and suspicion, eyes that once held kindness, now sharp with distrust. Sheriff Thomas Kellaway emerged from the courthouse, his boots crunching on the packed snow. His weathered face bore deep lines that seemed carved deeper this morning, and Martha could see the way his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his hat. The star pinned to his coat caught the pale winter sun, a reminder of the authority he wielded and the impossible position he now found himself in.
"Folks," Sheriff Kellaway's voice carried across the square, steady despite the circumstances. "I know you're all scared."
3 children missing in as many weeks, little Sarah Mitchell, Tommy Burns, and now the Hendricks boy. But pointing fingers without evidence won't bring them home. Martha's hands moved in quick, precise gestures, signing to her father. The townspeople watched this silent conversation with growing unease, their whispers carrying on the wind like dried leaves. She could read their lips easily enough after 18 years of relying on sight rather than sound. Unnatural, cursed, devil's work. Mrs. Hendricks pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears that had frozen into tiny crystals on her cheeks. "Your daughter was seen near the schoolhouse the day before each child disappeared, Sheriff. Walking alone, making those strange hand movements. My boy pointed it out just last week, said she was casting spells." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Martha felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the helplessness that came with being unable to speak her defense aloud. Her father's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his grizzled beard. "Martha doesn't cast spells, Eleanor. Those are signs, her way of talking. She's been helping Mrs. Peterson with the younger children after school, reading to them." Sheriff Kellaway's voice carried an edge of warning. "My daughter is no more capable of harming those children than you are." Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his black coat billowing in the wind. A thin man with pale eyes that seemed to see sin in every shadow. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge only months before, but had quickly gathered a following among the more devout townspeople.
"Sheriff Kellaway, I understand your desire to protect your child, but we must consider the possibility that the Lord is testing our community. The afflicted girl has been marked by silence, set apart from his creation. Perhaps this is his way of showing us the consequence of harboring what should not be."
Martha watched her father's face darken. Thomas Kellaway was not a religious man by nature, though he respected those who were. But something in the Reverend's tone, the way he called her afflicted, made his hands ball into fists. "Reverend Morrison, I'll thank you to remember that my daughter is a baptized member of this community. She lost her hearing and voice to scarlet fever when she was 3 years old. That's medicine, not divine judgment." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads. Martha could see the division forming. Families who had known her since childhood now uncertain, influenced by fear and the Reverend's carefully chosen words. Young Deputy Carson approached the group, his face flushed from the cold and something else. He leaned close to the sheriff, whispering urgently. Martha watched her father's expression change, his eyes widening slightly before he composed himself. "What is it, Thomas?" Mrs. Hendricks demanded. "What news about my boy?" Sheriff Kellaway looked across the crowd, his gaze lingering on Martha for a moment. In that look, she saw apology, love, and something that made her stomach drop like a stone in deep water. "We found tracks," he said slowly, leading away from where David Hendricks was last seen. Small boot prints, about the size Martha would wear. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps, angry shouts, and Mrs. Hendricks's wail of grief and rage. Martha felt the circle of townspeople close tighter around her, their faces transformed by fear into masks she barely recognized.
"But tracks don't tell the whole story," Sheriff Kellaway continued, raising his voice to be heard over the commotion.
"Could be any young woman in town. Could be someone trying to make it look like Martha was involved.
Or it could be exactly what it appears to be." Reverend Morrison's voice cut through the noise like a blade.
"Sheriff, I understand your paternal instincts, but justice demands we consider all possibilities. Perhaps it would be best if Miss Kellaway were placed under supervision until this matter is resolved. Martha's breath caught in her throat. Supervision meant confinement, meant being locked away like a criminal while the real killer continued to steal children from their beds. She signed rapidly to her father, her movements becoming more urgent as she saw him considering the Reverend's words.
No, Sheriff Kellaway said firmly. Martha stays with me. She's not under arrest, and she won't be treated like a prisoner based on boot prints and superstition.
The crowd shifted restlessly. Martha could see the doubt in their faces, the way some of the men were beginning to mutter among themselves. Her father's authority was being questioned, his judgment called into doubt because of his love for her.
Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store and had always been kind to Martha, stepped forward hesitantly. Sheriff, what if there was a compromise? What if Martha agreed not to be alone with any children until this is settled, just as a precaution? Martha's eyes met Mrs. Peterson's and saw genuine concern there, not malice.
The older woman was trying to find a middle ground, a way to protect Martha from the crowd's growing anger while addressing their fears. Sheriff Kellaway looked at his daughter, and Martha could read the question in his eyes. She thought of the 3 missing children, of their parents' anguish, of her father's impossible position. Slowly, she nodded.
All right, Sheriff Kellaway announced. Martha agrees to stay close to home and not be alone with any children until we find out what happened to the missing ones. But I want it understood that this is a voluntary precaution, not an admission of guilt.
The crowd seemed somewhat mollified, but Martha could see it wasn't enough for everyone. Reverend Morrison's pale eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, and Mrs. Hendricks continued to sob into her hands, her grief raw and accusatory. As the gathering began to disperse, Martha caught sight of something that made her pulse quicken. Near the edge of the crowd, partially hidden behind the blacksmith's cart, stood a figure in a dark coat. The person was watching her intently, but when Martha tried to focus on their face, they melted back into the shadows between buildings. She tugged on her father's sleeve and pointed, but when he looked, the figure was gone. Sheriff Kellaway's brow furrowed with concern, and Martha could see him scanning the area where she had pointed. "What is it?" he asked aloud, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear him. Then he looked at her directly, his lips forming the words clearly so she could read them. Martha shook her head, unsure how to explain what she had seen. The figure had been too distant to make out clearly, but something about their posture, the way they had watched her, felt significant. She made a few quick signs, trying to convey her unease. Deputy Carson approached them as the last of the townspeople wandered away. "Sheriff, what are your orders? Should we post someone to watch the house?" Martha saw her father's internal struggle play out across his features. The practical lawman in him recognized the wisdom of protection, but the father in him rebelled against the implication that his daughter needed to be guarded like a dangerous criminal. "No," he said finally, "but I want you to increase patrols around the residential areas, especially at night. And Carson, keep your ears open. People are scared, and scared people sometimes do foolish things." As they walked home through the snow-covered streets, Martha noticed how the few people they encountered either stared openly or made elaborate efforts to avoid looking at her at all. Children who used to wave now pressed closer to their parents, and she caught more than one person making the sign of the cross when they thought she wasn't looking. Their house sat at the end of Main Street, a modest 2-story building with a small jail attached to the back. It had been home for as long as Martha could remember, but today it felt different somehow, as if the morning's events had changed the very air inside its walls. Sheriff Kellaway hung up his coat and gun belt, his movements heavy with exhaustion. Martha watched him pour himself a cup of coffee from the pot that always sat on the stove, his hands steadier now that they were away from the crowd's scrutiny. She moved to the window and looked out at the town she had always called home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, and somewhere in those shadows, 3 children remained missing. The real killer was still out there, while she had become the focus of suspicion and fear. But Martha had advantages that others didn't recognize. Her silence had taught her to observe, to notice things that people who relied on sound often missed. She had seen the figure watching from the shadows, had noticed things in recent weeks that might seem insignificant to others, but formed a pattern in her mind. As the sun set and the temperature dropped even further, Martha made a decision that would have horrified her father if he had known. She would not simply wait at home while children disappeared and suspicion grew. Tonight, when the town slept and her father was making his rounds, she would begin her own investigation. The missing children deserved justice, and if the townspeople couldn't see past their fear and superstition, then it would be up to her to find the truth. Her silence, which they saw as a curse, would become her greatest asset in hunting a killer who thought they were beyond detection. Martha touched the frosted window pane with her fingertips, feeling the cold bite into her skin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new accusations, and new dangers. But tonight, she would begin to prove that the sheriff's daughter was not a monster to be feared, but a hunter to be reckoned with. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling through the empty streets. In that wind, Martha thought she heard something that made her blood run cold, though she knew it was impossible for her to hear anything at all.
Dawn broke gray and bitter over Cedar Ridge, the kind of morning that made bones ache and breath burn in the lungs. Martha woke before her father, as she had every day since childhood, and padded to the kitchen in her bare feet to start the coffee. The routine gave her comfort, a small island of normalcy in the storm that had engulfed their lives.
Through the kitchen window, she could see Deputy Carson pacing near the town well, his rifle cradled in his arms and his face red with cold. Her father had insisted there was no need for guards, but Carson had taken it upon himself to patrol their street more frequently. Whether this was protection or surveillance, Martha couldn't tell. Sheriff Kellaway emerged from his bedroom, already dressed and wearing the grim expression that had become his constant companion. He moved to the window beside Martha and watched his deputies' vigilant patrol, his jaw working silently as he considered the implications.
"Morning, Carson," he called out when he stepped onto the porch. Martha read his lips through the glass. "You been out here all night."
The deputy's response was lost to distance, but Martha could see the conversation's tone in their body language. Carson gestured toward the house, then toward the center of town, his movements sharp with urgency. Her father's shoulders sagged slightly, and when he returned inside, his face carried news that Martha dreaded to learn.
"Another child is missing," he said, facing her so she could read his lips clearly. "Little Mary Catherine Walsh. Her mother found her bed empty this morning, wet song, window open, no sign of struggle."
Martha's hands flew to her throat, a gesture of shock she had never been able to break despite years of silence. 4 children now, taken in the space of a month, and with each disappearance, the noose of suspicion tightened around her neck. Sheriff Kellaway moved to his gun cabinet, checking his weapons with the methodical precision of a man preparing for war. "I have to go to the Walsh place, examine the scene. You'll stay here, and you'll stay inside. No exceptions, Martha. Not today." She signed a protest, her movements quick and frustrated, but her father's expression brooked no argument. The easy partnership they had always shared, built on mutual respect and understanding, was cracking under the pressure of circumstance and public opinion.
"I mean it," he continued, his voice harder than she had ever heard it directed at her.
"People are talking about forming a committee, maybe taking matters into their own hands. Reverend Morrison is feeding their fears, and some of the men are listening. You go out today, especially alone, and I might not be able to protect you." The word protect stung more than Martha expected. She had never needed protection from the people of Cedar Ridge before, had never been anything more threatening than the sheriff's quiet, helpful daughter who could read lips and make children laugh with her expressive face and gentle ways. After her father left, Martha found herself trapped in a house that suddenly felt more like a cell. She moved restlessly from window to window, watching the town go about its business with an undercurrent of fear that was visible even from a distance. People moved in groups now, parents keeping their children close, and she noticed that several shops had closed early or remained shuttered entirely. By midday, the isolation was becoming unbearable. Martha had always been self-sufficient, comfortable with her own company, but the enforced confinement combined with the weight of suspicion made the walls seem to close in around her. She was considering the wisdom of a brief walk in her own backyard when a knock at the front door made her freeze. Through the lace curtains, she could see 3 figures on the porch. Reverend Morrison flanked by 2 men she recognized as deacons from his church. Their faces were set with the kind of righteous determination that had led to witch trials in earlier times, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air.
The Reverend knocked again, more insistently this time, and Martha realized that her father's absence had been noted and calculated. They had come when they knew she would be alone, when there would be no sheriff's badge to complicate their purpose. She remained perfectly still, hoping they would assume no one was home, but Reverend Morrison moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. His pale eyes locked with hers, and a thin smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Kellaway," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the glass. "We know you're in there. We've come to offer you spiritual guidance in your time of trial. Surely you won't turn away men of God."
Martha's mind raced. To refuse them entry would seem like guilt, but to let them in meant facing their interrogation without her father's protection. She could see neighbors beginning to gather across the street, drawn by the unusual sight of the Reverend and his deacons at the sheriff's house.
Slowly she opened the door but remained in the doorway, using her body to block their entrance. Reverend Morrison's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes.
"My child," he said, speaking slowly and clearly so she could read his lips, "I've come to offer you the chance for confession and redemption. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he uses the afflicted as instruments of his will, even when they don't understand their purpose." Martha shook her head firmly and began to close the door, but one of the deacons, a heavy-set man named Fletcher, placed his boot in the doorway to prevent it from shutting. "Now that's not very neighborly," Fletcher said, his voice carrying a menace that his pleasant expression couldn't disguise. "The Reverend is offering you salvation, girl. You'd be wise to listen."
The situation was escalating beyond Martha's ability to control. She could see more people gathering on the street, and some of them were carrying tools that could easily become weapons. The crowd from the morning had reformed spontaneously, drawn together by some invisible signal that Martha couldn't perceive, but whose effects she could clearly see. Reverend Morrison stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the fervent gleam in his pale eyes. "The children who have been taken, Miss Kellaway. They were all pure of heart, innocent before God. If you have knowledge of their fate, if you have been used as an instrument of judgment, confession can still save your soul." Martha's hands moved involuntarily, signing her denial and frustration, but her gestures only seemed to agitate the growing crowd. She heard someone shout, "Devil's signs," and saw several people make the sign of the cross.
It was then that Martha noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among the faces in the crowd,
she spotted the same dark-coated figure she had seen the day before, still too distant to identify clearly, but watching her with the same intense focus. This time, however, the figure was not hiding, but standing boldly among the townspeople, as if they belonged there completely. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The real killer was here, watching her persecution with satisfaction, perhaps even helping to orchestrate it. While she was being cornered and threatened, they were free to plan their next move, secure in the knowledge that suspicion had fallen entirely on her. Martha's sudden understanding must have shown on her face because Reverend Morrison leaned even closer, mistaking her horror for guilt. "Yes, my child, I can see the truth struggling to break free. Let it out. Tell us what you know about those innocent babes." But Martha's attention was no longer on the Reverend or his threatening companions. She was studying the crowd, trying to fix the location and appearance of the mysterious figure in her memory. They were of medium height, neither particularly tall nor short, with their face partially obscured by a hat pulled low. The coat they wore was dark brown or black, well made but not distinctive enough to mark them as wealthy or poor. What struck her most was their stillness. While everyone else in the crowd shifted and murmured, pointing and whispering, this figure remained perfectly motionless, as if they were not truly part of the mob, but something separate, something watching from outside. "Miss Kellaway," Reverend Morrison's sharp tone brought her attention back to the immediate danger. "Your mind seems to wander to dark places. Perhaps that is where we will find the answers we seek." Martha made a desperate decision. She pointed directly at the mysterious figure in the crowd, her gesture unmistakable and urgent. Several people turned to look where she pointed, but by the time their eyes found the spot, the figure had vanished as if they had never been there at all. The crowd's reaction was immediate and ugly. Someone shouted that she was trying to cast suspicion on innocent people, and Martha heard the word witch spoken aloud for the first time. The mood was turning dangerous, and she could see in the Reverend's eyes that he was prepared to let it happen. It was Deputy Carson who saved her, arriving at a run with his rifle at the ready. The young man's face was flushed with exertion and anger as he took in the scene. Martha trapped in her doorway by the Reverend and his deacons, the crowd growing larger and more agitated by the minute.
"Reverend Morrison," Carson called out, his voice carrying the authority of his badge despite his youth. "I think you and your friends need to step away from the sheriff's house. Now."
The Reverend's pale eyes flicked to the rifle in Carson's hands, calculating odds and consequences. After a long moment, he stepped back with obvious reluctance. "Of course, Deputy. We were simply offering spiritual comfort to a troubled soul, but I fear Miss Kellaway's condition may be more serious than her father realizes. Perhaps professional evaluation would be in order." The threat was clear and chilling. Professional evaluation meant doctors from the territorial capital, men who might declare her mentally incompetent or dangerous. It meant losing what little freedom and protection she still possessed. Carson positioned himself between Martha and the crowd, his rifle held casually but ready. "The sheriff will be back soon," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Until then, I suggest folks go about their business. Standing around in the cold won't bring those children home any faster." The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, but Martha noticed that several people lingered at the edges of the square, maintaining their surveillance from a distance. The mysterious figure was nowhere to be seen, but Martha had the unsettling feeling that they were still watching from some hidden vantage point. Reverend Morrison was the last to leave, his pale eyes holding Martha's gaze until the very moment he turned away. "This isn't over, child," he said, his words barely more than a whisper. "Truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried." After the crowd dispersed, Carson remained on the porch, his young face troubled. Martha gestured for him to come inside, but he shook his head. "Sheriff's orders were clear," he said, reading her gesture correctly. "No one in the house while he's gone, not even me. But I'll stay out here. Make sure no one bothers you again." Martha nodded gratefully. But as she closed the door, she realized that Carson's protection came with its own price. She was now under guard in truth, watched as much for the town's safety as for her own. The net was closing around her with each passing hour, and somewhere in the shadows, the real killer was free to plan their next move. As evening approached and her father still had not returned, Martha made another decision that would have horrified him. Tonight, she would not be a passive victim waiting for rescue or condemnation. Tonight, she would use her watcher's assumption that she was safely contained to begin her own hunt. The children of Cedar Ridge deserved justice, and if she was to have any hope of clearing her name and stopping the real killer, she would have to act soon. The mysterious figure in the crowd had made one mistake. They had revealed themselves twice now, which meant they had a pattern, a reason for watching her persecution so closely. Martha moved away from the windows and began to prepare for the night ahead. Her silence, which the townspeople saw as evidence of guilt or supernatural affliction, would become her greatest weapon in the hunt to come. The clock in the parlor chimed 11 times before Sheriff Kellaway finally returned home, his boots heavy on the porch steps, and his face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from examining crime scenes and consoling devastated parents. Martha watched from her bedroom window as he spoke briefly with Deputy Carson, their conversation illuminated by the pale glow of the moon on fresh snow. When her father entered the house, Martha was waiting at the kitchen table with hot coffee and a plate of bread. She could read the defeat in his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly as he removed his coat and gun belt. The investigation at the Walsh house had yielded nothing useful, she could tell, just as the previous scenes had offered no clues beyond the maddening boot prints that matched her size.
4 children, Martha, he said, sinking into his chair and accepting the coffee with grateful hands.
4 families destroyed, and I'm no closer to finding answers than I was 3 weeks ago. The tracks lead to the creek and disappear in the water every time. It's like whoever is doing this knows exactly how to cover their trail.
Martha signed a question, her movements careful and deliberate. Her father's ability to read her signing had improved dramatically over the years, born of necessity and love, but tonight his exhaustion made him slower to interpret her gestures.
"What did I find different this time?" he translated, his brow furrowing as he considered her question. The Walsh girl's window was opened from the inside, just like the others. No sign of struggle, no indication she was afraid of whoever took her. "That's what bothers me most, Martha. These children are going willingly with someone they trust." The implications of this revelation hit Martha like a physical blow. Someone the children trusted meant someone from the community. Someone who had regular contact with families and had earned their confidence over time. It also meant that her father's investigation was focused on strangers and outsiders when the real threat came from within Cedar Ridge itself.
Sheriff Kellaway rubbed his eyes with the
Heels of his hands, a gesture Martha had seen countless times when he was wrestling with a particularly difficult case. "There's going to be a town meeting tomorrow night," he continued. "Mayor Davidson is calling it, but I suspect Reverend Morrison is the real force behind it. They want to discuss protective measures for the remaining children."
Martha's blood ran cold.
She knew exactly what kind of protective measures would be discussed, and she knew who would bear the brunt of the town's fear and anger. Her signing became more urgent as she asked about the specifics of the meeting. "They want to establish a curfew for all children, organize patrols, and—" He paused, unable to meet her eyes. "They want to discuss your situation. Morrison has been talking to people, Martha. He's convinced half the town that your condition makes you susceptible to evil influences." The coffee cup trembled in Martha's hands as she set it down. She had expected suspicion and fear, but the systematic campaign being waged against her by the Reverend was more dangerous than she had imagined. Morrison was not simply responding to community fears, he was actively cultivating and directing them. Her father reached across the table and took her hands in his calloused fingers warm and reassuring. "I won't let them hurt you," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "Whatever happens at that meeting, whatever they decide, you're my daughter, and I'll protect you." Martha squeezed his hands gratefully, but she could see the strain in his face, the impossible position he was being forced into. A sheriff who couldn't maintain the trust of his community was no sheriff at all, and defending her was costing him the authority he needed to find the real killer. After her father retired to his bedroom, Martha lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Through her window, she could see Deputy Carson making his rounds, his lantern casting moving shadows across the snow. The young deputy was conscientious and loyal, but his presence also meant that any nocturnal investigation would require careful planning and perfect timing. At midnight, Martha rose and dressed in her darkest clothes, moving with the silent efficiency that years of deafness had taught her. She could feel vibrations through the floorboards when people moved about the house, sense changes in air currents when doors opened or closed, perceive the subtle shifts in light that indicated activity in other parts of the building. Her father's breathing had settled into the deep, regular rhythm of exhausted sleep, and Carson's patrol pattern had become predictable over the past 2 days. She had a window of perhaps 20 minutes between his passes, enough time to slip out the back door and begin her own investigation if she moved carefully.
Martha eased open this kitchen door and stepped into the bitter night air, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the wind. The snow crunched softly under her feet as she made her way toward the center of town, staying in the shadows between buildings and avoiding the main thoroughfares where Carson might spot her. Her destination was the area behind the schoolhouse,
where she had supposedly been seen before each child's disappearance. If someone was deliberately creating evidence to implicate her, they would have had to know her routines and movements well enough to place those boot prints convincingly. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of Cedar Ridge's residential district, a modest wooden building surrounded by a yard where children played during warmer months. Now it looked abandoned and slightly sinister in the moonlight, its windows dark and its door secured with a heavy chain and lock.
Martha circled the building carefully, looking for signs of recent activity. The snow around the structure was
Crisscrossed with tracks from the various investigations, but she noticed something that the others had apparently missed: a set of larger boot prints, adult-sized, that paralleled the small prints everyone assumed were hers.
She knelt in the snow, studying the impressions more carefully. The larger prints were deeper, indicating someone of greater weight, and the stride pattern suggested someone taller than her modest height. Most importantly, these prints had been made at the same time as the smaller ones, evidenced by the way snow had drifted into both sets equally.
Someone had been walking alongside the person who left the small boot prints, matching their pace and staying close enough to guide or control their movements. Martha felt a surge of excitement at this discovery, the first real clue that pointed away from her guilt and toward a more complex explanation. She was so absorbed in examining the tracks that she almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps crunching through snow. Martha's head snapped up and she saw a dark figure walking purposefully toward the schoolhouse from the direction of the church. It was too dark to make out features, but something about the person's build and gait seemed familiar. Martha pressed herself against the side of the schoolhouse, using the building's shadow to conceal her presence. The figure approached to within 30 feet of her hiding spot before stopping and seeming to scan the area carefully. For a terrifying moment, Martha thought she had been spotted, but the figure's attention appeared to be focused on the ground, where the boot prints were most visible. The person knelt in the snow just as Martha had done, examining the tracks with what appeared to be professional interest. They spent several minutes studying the scene, occasionally moving to different vantage points, before producing something from their coat that glinted in the moonlight. A knife. The figure was using a knife to disturb the snow around the tracks, carefully obliterating the evidence that Martha had just discovered. They worked with methodical precision, erasing the larger boot prints while leaving the smaller ones intact, ensuring that any future investigation would continue to point suspicion in her direction. Martha watched in horrified fascination as the real killer calmly destroyed evidence that could have cleared her name. The person's movements were confident and unhurried, suggesting they felt completely safe in their work. They had no reason to fear discovery, since the entire town was focused on the sheriff's daughter as the most likely suspect. When the figure finished their work and stood to leave, Martha made a desperate decision. Moving as quietly as her years of silence had taught her, she began to follow them back toward town. She needed to know who this person was, where they went, what other secrets they might be hiding. The chase led through Cedar Ridge's back alleys and side streets, past darkened homes where families slept unaware that the real danger to their children was walking freely among them. Martha stayed far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to keep the figure in sight as they moved with obvious familiarity through the town's layout. To her surprise, the person's destination was not one of the outlying houses or business establishments, but the very heart of Cedar Ridge's moral authority. The church. Martha watched from behind a fence post as the figure produced a key and let themselves into the building through a side door. The implications were staggering. Either someone had stolen keys to the church, or the killer was someone with legitimate access to the building. Given Reverend Morrison's campaign against her and his intimate knowledge of the community's fears and prejudices, Martha began to suspect that the truth was even more horrifying than she had imagined. She crept closer to the church, looking for windows that might allow her to observe what was happening inside. Most of the building's windows were too high or too well covered to provide a view, but she found a basement window that had been left slightly ajar, probably for ventilation.
Martha knelt in the snow beside the window and peered through the gap. The basement was dimly lit by candles, and she could see the dark-coated figure moving about with purpose.
They had removed their outer garments, revealing clothes that Martha recognized with a shock of horror and disbelief. Mrs. Peterson, the kindly store owner who had tried to find a compromise during yesterday's confrontation, was arranging items on what appeared to be an altar or workspace. The woman who had always been gentle with Martha, who had defended her to suspicious customers and offered support during difficult times, was carefully laying out children's clothing and personal belongings like trophies or ritual objects. Martha's world tilted sickeningly as she realized the scope of the deception. Mrs. Peterson had access to every family in town through her store, knew all the children personally, had their trust and that of their parents. She would know their routines, their habits, their fears and preferences. She would be someone they would follow willingly, even out of their beds on a cold winter night.
Even more devastating was the realization that Mrs. Peterson had been present at both public confrontations, had seemed to support Martha while subtly reinforcing the community's suspicions. She had suggested the compromise that kept Martha under house arrest, effectively removing her from the investigation while providing the perfect cover for continued disappearances.
As Martha watched in frozen horror, Mrs. Peterson began to sort through what were obviously the missing children's belongings. She handled each item with disturbing tenderness, as if they held some special significance or power. The ritualistic nature of her actions suggested that the children's disappearances were not random crimes, but part of some larger, more sinister purpose.
Martha knew she had to get this information to her father immediately, but she also knew that her word alone would not be enough. She was already suspected of the crimes herself, and accusing the town's most respected businesswoman would only seem like a desperate attempt to shift blame. She needed proof, evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. But as she watched Mrs. Peterson complete her grisly inventory and begin to extinguish the candles, Martha realized that obtaining such proof would require her to get much closer to a killer who had already demonstrated both cunning and ruthlessness. The basement went dark, and Martha heard footsteps on the stairs above her hiding spot. Mrs. Peterson was leaving, probably returning home to prepare for another day of playing the concerned community member while planning her next abduction. Martha pressed herself against the foundation of the church, hardly daring to breathe as the killer passed within feet of her position. Only when the footsteps had faded completely into the distance did she dare to move, her limbs stiff with cold and shock. As she made her way back home through the pre-dawn darkness, Martha's mind raced with the implications of what she had discovered. Mrs. Peterson's deception ran deeper than simple child abduction. It suggested a level of psychological manipulation and community infiltration that was truly chilling. But Martha also knew that her discovery had put her in mortal danger. If Mrs. Peterson suspected that her secret had been uncovered, she would not hesitate to eliminate the threat. The woman had already demonstrated her willingness to destroy innocent lives. One more death would not trouble her conscience. The house was still dark when Martha slipped back inside, her father's breathing unchanged from its exhausted rhythm. Deputy Carson was completing another circuit of the property, his lantern visible through the kitchen window as he made his dutiful rounds. Martha climbed the stairs to her bedroom, but sleep was impossible. Tomorrow night's town meeting would determine her fate, and she now knew that Mrs. Peterson would be there, playing her role as a concerned citizen while working to ensure that suspicion remained focused on the sheriff's daughter.
Time was running out, and Martha had to find a way to expose the truth before Mrs. Peterson claimed another victim, or the town's fear boiled over into violence. The silent hunt had revealed the killer's identity, but the most dangerous part of the game was just beginning. The town meeting convened at 7 o'clock in the evening, filling the church sanctuary with grim-faced men and women who clutched their remaining children close and spoke in hushed, urgent whispers. Martha sat in the front row beside her father, acutely aware that every eye in the building was fixed on her with a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. Reverend Morrison stood at the pulpit, his pale eyes gleaming with righteous fervor as he surveyed the packed congregation. Mrs. Peterson sat 3 rows behind Martha, her face a mask of concerned citizenship that made Martha's skin crawl with the knowledge of what lay beneath that carefully constructed facade.
Brothers and sisters, Reverend Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed sanctuary,
we gather tonight in the shadow of great evil. 4 innocent children have been stolen from their beds, taken by forces that move in darkness and silence. We must act decisively to protect those who remain. Mayor Davidson, a portly man with thinning hair and nervous hands, rose from his seat in the second row. Reverend Morrison speaks truly. The territorial authorities have been notified, but help is days away. We cannot wait for outside assistance while more children disappear. Sheriff Kellaway stood slowly, his badge catching the lamplight as he turned to face the assembly. Martha could see the strain in his posture, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on his shoulders.
Folks, I understand your fear. I share it, but we cannot let panic drive us to actions we'll regret. The investigation is ongoing, and I believe we're close to finding answers.
What investigation? The voice belonged to Fletcher, one of Morrison's deacons, and it carried the anger of a community pushed beyond its breaking point. You found nothing but boot prints that lead to your own daughter's door, Sheriff. How much more evidence do we need? Martha felt her father's tensions spike, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. She wanted to sign to him, to offer some comfort or support, but she knew that any movement from her would only inflame the crowd's suspicions. Mrs. Peterson rose gracefully from her seat, her voice gentle but carrying clearly through the church. Perhaps we should consider temporary measures while Sheriff Kellaway continues his investigation. The children's safety must be our first priority. The hypocrisy of those words, spoken by the woman who had been stealing and murdering those same children, made bile rise in Martha's throat. She watched Mrs. Peterson's performance with horrified fascination, seeing how expertly the woman manipulated the crowd's emotions while maintaining her mask of concerned respectability.
What measures do you suggest, Mrs. Peterson? Mayor Davidson asked, his relief obvious at having someone propose solutions rather than simply voice complaints. A curfew for all children, naturally. No child under 16 should be outside after dark without adult supervision. Additionally, perhaps we should consider having our most vulnerable residents stay with trusted families until this crisis passes. Martha's blood ran cold as she realized the true purpose behind Mrs. Peterson's suggestion.
The woman was positioning herself to gain access to even more children under the guise of protection. How many families would eagerly accept her offer to house their children, never suspecting that they were delivering their most precious possessions directly into the killer's hands?
Reverend Morrison nodded approvingly from his position at the pulpit.
Mrs. Peterson's wisdom is evident, as always, but I fear we must also address the elephant in our sanctuary. There is one among us whose very presence may be attracting this evil. The sanctuary fell silent except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Martha felt the weight of every gaze in the building pressing down on her like a physical force. Her father's jaw clenched, and she could see him preparing to defend her against whatever accusation was about to be leveled. The sheriff's daughter has been marked by silence, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. Cut off from God's gift of speech and hearing, she exists in a realm between the natural and unnatural worlds. Is it not possible that this liminal state makes her a conduit for dark forces? Martha's hands moved involuntarily, signing her denial and frustration, but her gestures only seemed to reinforce Morrison's point in the minds of the crowd. Several people crossed themselves, and she heard whispered prayers rising from various corners of the sanctuary. Sheriff Kellaway's voice cut through the murmur like a blade. Reverend Morrison, I won't sit here and listen to you condemn my daughter based on superstition and ignorance. Martha lost her hearing and voice to scarlet fever, not to Satan's influence.
Yet the evidence suggests otherwise, Morrison replied smoothly. Her footprints at every scene, her presence near the missing children before their disappearances, her inability to account for her whereabouts. Perhaps she is as much a victim as the missing children, but that does not diminish the danger she represents.
Martha could bear no more. She rose abruptly from her seat, ignoring her father's restraining hand, and walked deliberately to the front of the sanctuary. The crowd's murmur died completely as she positioned herself where everyone could see her clearly.
Her hands began to move in the precise, deliberate gestures of sign language, but she knew that few people in the audience could understand her words. Instead, she relied on the universal language of expression and body movement to convey her message. She pointed to herself, then shook her head firmly. She gestured toward the missing children's families, her face showing the grief and concern that filled her heart. She pointed to the church itself, then made the sign for truth, her movements becoming more urgent and passionate as she tried to communicate what she had discovered. "Look at her," Fletcher shouted from the crowd, "making her devil signs, trying to cast spells on us all." But Mrs. Peterson's reaction was different, more subtle, and far more telling to someone who knew what to watch for. The older woman's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on Martha with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear or religious fervor. Martha saw recognition there, and calculation, and something that made her heart race with terror. Mrs. Peterson knew that Martha had discovered her secret.
The realization must have shown in Martha's face because Mrs. Peterson rose smoothly from her seat, her expression shifting to one of maternal concern. "The poor child is clearly distressed," she said, her voice carrying perfectly through the silent sanctuary. "Perhaps she should be taken home before her condition worsens."
But Martha was not finished. Moving with desperate determination, she walked directly to where Mrs. Peterson stood and began signing again, this time pointing directly at the woman while making the gestures for danger, for deception, for murder. Her movements became more frantic as she tried to warn the crowd about the killer standing in their midst. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Shouts of "witch" and "devil's work" filled the air, and several men began moving toward Martha with clearly hostile intent. Her father pushed through the crowd, trying to reach her before the situation turned violent, but the press of angry bodies made his progress slow and difficult.
It was Mrs. Peterson who reached Martha first, placing gentle hands on the young woman's shoulders in what appeared to be a calming gesture. To the crowd, she looked like a saint trying to soothe a disturbed soul, but Martha could feel the iron strength in those supposedly gentle fingers and see the cold calculation in the woman's eyes. "There, child," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice pitched to carry through the sanctuary. "You're overwrought, understandably so. Let me help you home where you can rest." Martha tried to pull away, but Mrs. Peterson's grip tightened painfully. The woman was stronger than she appeared, and her position as Martha's apparent helper made any struggle look like further evidence of mental disturbance. "I think that's wise," Reverend Morrison said from the pulpit. "Mrs. Peterson, you have such a way with troubled souls. Perhaps you could stay with the girl tonight, ensure she doesn't harm herself or others." The trap was closing with terrifying efficiency. Mrs. Peterson was maneuvering herself into position to be alone with Martha, using the crowd's fear and the Reverend's authority to create the perfect opportunity for murder. No one would question the respected businesswoman's motives, and if Martha were found dead in the morning, it would be explained as suicide brought on by guilt and mental instability. Sheriff Kellaway finally broke through the crowd, his face dark with anger and concern. "Martha comes home with me," he said firmly, reaching for his daughter's arm. But Mrs. Peterson was ready for this objection. "Sheriff, with all due respect, you're too close to this situation to see clearly. Your paternal feelings are preventing you from recognizing the danger your daughter represents, both to the community and to herself." "The woman speaks sense," Mayor Davidson added, his nervousness making him eager to find solutions that didn't require him to make difficult decisions. Perhaps it would be best if Martha stayed with Mrs. Peterson tonight, just as a precaution. Martha's signing became desperate, her hands moving in quick, sharp gestures as she tried to warn her father about the trap being laid. But Sheriff Kellaway's ability to read her signing was compromised by stress and the crowd's hostility, and her frantic movements only reinforced the impression that she was becoming dangerously unstable. "No," Sheriff Kellaway said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The crowd was against him, his own judgment was being questioned, and the weight of community pressure was enormous. Martha could see him wavering, see the doubt creeping into his eyes.
It was then that Martha made the most desperate decision of her life. Breaking free from Mrs. Peterson's grip with a sudden, violent movement, she ran toward the altar at the front of the church. The crowd gasped and recoiled as she grabbed a heavy brass candlestick and raised it above her head like a weapon.
For a moment, the sanctuary was frozen in tableau. Martha standing at the altar with the candlestick raised,
Miss Peterson positioned between her and the crowd with her hands extended in apparent concern, Sheriff Kellaway pushing forward with his gun half drawn, and dozens of townspeople pressed back against the pews in fear. Then Martha brought the candlestick down, not on any person but on the wooden collection box that sat on the altar. The box splintered under the blow, spilling coins and bills across the floor, but also revealing something else hidden in its depths. A child's mitten, small and blue, and unmistakably belonging to one of the missing children. The sanctuary erupted in chaos as people saw the evidence scattered across the altar floor. Mrs. Peterson's carefully constructed mask finally slipped, her face showing naked fury and calculation as she realized her hiding place had been discovered. But the woman was not finished. Even as the crowd began to understand what they were seeing, Mrs. Peterson was moving, her hand disappearing into her coat to emerge with a small but deadly knife. Her target was not the crowd, but Martha herself, the one person who could tie her to the missing children. Sheriff Kellaway's gun cleared its holster just as Mrs. Peterson lunged forward, her blade aimed at Martha's heart. The shot echoed through the sanctuary like thunder, and Mrs. Peterson spun away from her target, the knife flying from her grasp to clatter across the floor.
The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Peterson lay crumpled near the altar, her breathing shallow and her eyes fixed on Martha with undiminished hatred. Blood spread slowly across the floor, dark and accusatory in the lamplight.
"The basement," Martha signed frantically to her father, her hands shaking with shock and adrenaline. "More evidence in the church basement." Sheriff Kellaway's face was grim as he organized a search party to investigate Martha's claim. What they found in the basement would haunt the town for years to come. Children's clothing arranged like trophies, detailed journals documenting Mrs. Peterson's obsession with what she called purification through sacrifice, and most damning of all, evidence that the 4 missing children had been murdered and buried in the cellar's dirt floor. As the terrible truth emerged, the crowd's mood shifted from anger at Martha to horror at their own blindness. They had been so ready to blame the different, the voiceless, the vulnerable, that they had ignored the evil hiding in plain sight among them. But Martha knew that Mrs. Peterson's death would not undo the damage that had been done. 4 children were gone forever, their lives stolen by a woman who had hidden behind respectability and community trust. The town would heal, but slowly, and the scars would remain visible for generations. Standing in the sanctuary surrounded by the wreckage of her accusations and Mrs. Peterson's deceptions, Martha felt the weight of what she had been forced to do. She had broken every rule of her quiet, careful existence, had violated her father's instructions and the town's expectations, had resorted to violence to save her own life and expose the truth. The sheriff's daughter was no longer the silent, invisible girl who had moved through Cedar Ridge without making waves. She had found her voice in the most desperate circumstances, and that voice would never be silenced again. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days after Mrs. Peterson's death, a weathered man named Harrison who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to cleaning up other people's messes. He spent the better part of a week interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and piecing together the full scope of Mrs. Peterson's crimes from the detailed journals found in the church basement. Martha sat across from Marshal Harrison in her father's office, her hands steady as she provided her account of the events through sign language while Sheriff Kellaway translated. The marshal watched her with intelligent eyes that held neither suspicion nor pity, treating her testimony with the same professional attention he gave to any witness. "Miss Kellaway," Marshal Harrison said, speaking directly to her while her father interpreted, "your actions that night undoubtedly saved lives. Mrs. Peterson's journals indicate she was planning to take at least 3 more children before winter's end."
The weight of those words settled heavily in the small office. Martha had known that stopping Mrs. Peterson was urgent, but seeing the scope of the woman's planned murders, written in neat handwriting, had been a revelation of evil that still made her hands shake.
Sheriff Kellaway's voice was hoarse as he continued translating. The marshal says the territorial court will want a full report, but there will be no charges filed against you or Martha. The evidence clearly shows self-defense and justifiable intervention.
Martha nodded her understanding, but she knew that legal vindication was only one aspect of what she would have to live with going forward. The town's reaction to the revelations had been complex and troubling, ranging from shame at their readiness to blame her to anger at being deceived by someone they had trusted. Some families had approached her father with awkward apologies, trying to make amends for their suspicion and hostility. Others seemed almost resentful that their prejudices had been proven wrong, as if Martha's innocence was somehow an inconvenience that complicated their worldview. Reverend Morrison had left town the morning after the truth came out, his departure as sudden and unexplained as his arrival months earlier. Martha suspected that his campaign against her had been motivated by more than religious fervor, perhaps by some prior knowledge of Mrs. Peterson's activities or his own complicity in creating the atmosphere that allowed her crimes to continue. The missing children had been laid to rest in a small ceremony attended by the entire town. Martha had stood with the grieving families, her presence no longer a source of suspicion, but a reminder of how close they had come to losing even more innocence to Mrs. Peterson's madness. Deputy Carson knocked on the office door, his young face serious as he entered with a telegram in his hand. "Sheriff, this just came in from the territorial capital. It's about Mrs. Peterson." Sheriff Kellaway took the telegram and read it quickly, his expression darkening as he absorbed the information. He looked up at Marshal Harrison, then at Martha, before speaking.
There have been similar cases in 3 other territories over the past 5 years. Children disappearing in small towns, always in winter, always with evidence pointing to local outsiders or unusual residents. The authorities never connected them until now.
Martha's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. Mrs. Peterson had not been acting on sudden impulse or isolated madness. She had been a traveling killer, moving from community to community and perfecting her methods of deflecting suspicion while claiming victims.
Marshal Harrison took the telegram and studied it carefully. She would establish herself in a town, usually as a shopkeeper or boarding house operator, someone with regular contact with families. Then she would identify the most vulnerable person in the community and begin a campaign to make them the focus of suspicion when children started disappearing. "How many?" Martha signed, her movements sharp with controlled anger. Sheriff Kellaway translated the question, and Marshal Harrison consulted the telegram again. "At least 16 children across 4 territories, possibly more that we haven't discovered yet." She kept detailed records, treated it like a science. The scope of Mrs. Peterson's crimes was staggering, but what haunted Martha most was the realization of how perfectly she had been set up as the ideal scapegoat. A deaf and mute young woman, already isolated from normal social interaction, living with the town's primary law enforcement officer, who would be compromised in any investigation. "There's something else," Marshal Harrison continued, his voice gentler now. "The records show that Mrs. Peterson had been planning this for months before she even arrived in Cedar Ridge. She researched your family specifically, knew about your condition and your father's position. This town was chosen because you were here."
The revelation hit Martha like a physical blow. She had not been a random target or a convenient scapegoat.
But the specific reason Mrs. Peterson had come to Cedar Ridge. The woman had traveled hundreds of miles and spent months establishing her cover identity, all for the purpose of using Martha as a shield for her crimes. Sheriff Kellaway's face had gone pale as he processed the marshal's words. "You're saying she came here to destroy my daughter. I'm saying she came here because your daughter's situation made her the perfect victim to frame." Mrs. Peterson was methodical, calculating. She studied communities and identified the residents who would be most vulnerable to accusation and least able to defend themselves effectively. Martha stood abruptly and walked to the window, needing to look out at the town she had called home all her life. The knowledge that Mrs. Peterson had specifically targeted her, had planned her destruction with such cold calculation, made every memory of the woman's kindness feel like a violation.
But there was something else in the marshal's revelation that filled Martha with a different kind of emotion.
Validation. Her instincts had been correct. her suspicions justified, her desperate actions necessary. She had not been paranoid or unstable, but the target of a sophisticated predator who had counted on her isolation and vulnerability to ensure her silence. Deputy Carson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Marshal, there's a delegation from the town council waiting outside. They want to speak with you about the situation." Marshal Harrison glanced at Sheriff Kellaway, who nodded wearily. The political aftermath of Mrs. Peterson's crimes would be almost as complex as the investigation itself. Communities did not like to be reminded of their capacity for mob hysteria, their readiness to turn on the innocent when fear overwhelmed reason.
"Send them in," Sheriff Kellaway said, then turned to Martha. "You don't have to stay for this if you don't want to."
But Martha shook her head firmly and returned to her seat beside her father's desk. She had been the target of the town's suspicion and anger. She would face whatever came next with the same courage that had carried her through the darkest days of the crisis. The delegation consisted of Mayor Davidson, 3 members of the town council, and Dr. Matthews, the elderly physician who served Cedar Ridge and the surrounding ranches. Their faces showed the uncomfortable mixture of shame and self-justification that Martha had seen on so many townspeople over the past week. Mayor Davidson spoke first, his words careful and formal. "Marshal Harrison, we want to express our gratitude for your thorough investigation and your help in resolving this terrible situation. The town of Cedar Ridge is deeply appreciative of your efforts. And we want to make it clear," Councilman Fletcher added quickly, "that any actions taken by individual citizens during this crisis do not reflect the official position of the town government."
Martha watched this performance with growing anger. The town leaders were trying to distance themselves from the mob mentality that had nearly led to her destruction, rewriting history to make themselves appear more reasonable and measured than they had actually been. Marshal Harrison seemed to understand the subtext as well. "Gentlemen, I've read the witness statements and examined the evidence. The actions of your community during this crisis were driven by fear, but they were also enabled by leadership that failed to maintain order and protect all citizens equally." The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by Dr. Matthews, whose weathered face showed genuine remorse. "Marshal, we failed Martha terribly. There's no excuse for how quickly we were willing to believe the worst about her, how ready we were to let fear override common sense and human decency." Martha appreciated the doctor's honesty, but she knew that individual apologies could not undo the broader damage that had been done. The town had revealed something about itself during the crisis, a willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable to protect the majority that would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. "What matters now," Marshal Harrison continued, "is how the community moves forward. Miss Kellaway saved lives by her actions, but she should never have been put in a position where such actions were necessary." Mayor Davidson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Marshal, we understand that mistakes were made. The town is prepared to make appropriate accommodations to ensure that this situation doesn't happen again." The word accommodations made Martha's skin crawl. She could imagine what form such accommodations might take: special consideration, careful monitoring, the kind of patronizing protection that would mark her as permanently different and potentially dangerous. She stood again and began signing rapidly, her movements sharp and decisive. Sheriff Kellaway watched her hands carefully before translating her words. "Martha says she doesn't want accommodations or special treatment. She wants to be treated like any other citizen of Cedar Ridge, with the same rights and responsibilities as everyone else." Marshal Harrison nodded approvingly. "Miss Kellaway, you've more than earned that right. Your courage and intelligence saved this community from a killer who had already claimed too many innocent lives." But Martha wasn't finished. Her hands continued to move, her message becoming more pointed and direct. Sheriff Kellaway hesitated before translating, then seemed to decide that his daughter's words needed to be heard regardless of their discomfort. "She says that the real test of this community's character won't be how it treats her now. When her innocence is proven and her heroism is recognized, it will be how you treat the next person who is different, vulnerable, or unable to defend themselves effectively."
The delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly understanding that Martha's words were both a challenge and a warning. The young woman who had been their intended victim was now their moral conscience, holding up a mirror that reflected their capacity for both justice and injustice. As the meeting concluded and the officials filed out, Martha remained at the window, watching the town go about its daily business. Children played in the snow under their parents' watchful eyes, merchants conducted their trade, and life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. But Martha knew that Cedar Ridge would never be quite the same. Mrs. Peterson's crimes had left scars that would take years to heal, and the community's reaction to those crimes had revealed truths about human nature that could not be easily forgotten. The sheriff's daughter had found her voice in the most desperate circumstances, but keeping that voice would require constant vigilance. The forces that had nearly destroyed her were not unique to Mrs. Peterson or to Cedar Ridge, but part of the human condition itself.
Martha touched the frost-covered window pane and made a silent promise to herself and to the memory of the 4 children who had not lived to see justice done. She would never again be silent when silence enabled evil. Never again allow fear to triumph over truth. Never again let the vulnerable stand alone against those who would destroy them.
The town might heal, but it would do so under the watchful eyes of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required breaking every rule except the most important one, protecting those who could not protect themselves.
Spring came early to Cedar Ridge that year, melting the snow that had witnessed so much tragedy and revealing the brown earth beneath like a promise of renewal. Martha stood in the cemetery where 4 small headstones marked the graves of Mrs. Peterson's victims, their names carved in granite that would outlast the memory of those who had failed to protect them.
6 months had passed since the night in the church, and the town had settled into a new rhythm shaped by the knowledge of what they had nearly allowed to happen. Martha's role in the community had evolved in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. No longer the silent, invisible sheriff's daughter, she had become something unprecedented, a voice for those who had no voice. The changes had begun small and practical. Dr. Matthews had asked her to help with a patient who had been injured in a mining accident and lost his ability to speak. Martha had taught the man basic signs and shown his family how to communicate with him, transforming their despair into hope. Word of her success had spread, and soon parents were bringing children who struggled with speech, elderly residents who were losing their hearing, and immigrants who found English difficult to master. Martha discovered that her years of navigating a world of sound through sight and intuition had given her unique insights into human communication that went far beyond spoken words. Sheriff Kellaway watched his daughter's transformation with pride and amazement. The girl who had once moved through life, trying to avoid attention, now held regular classes in the church basement, teaching sign language and helping people find new ways to connect with each other. "You're changing this town," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "Not just because of what happened with Mrs. Peterson, but because you're showing people that being different doesn't mean being less." Martha's hands moved in response, her signing more confident and fluid than it had ever been. She was no longer trying to make herself smaller or less noticeable, but using her abilities to build bridges between people who had previously felt isolated from their community. The spring also brought visitors, families from other territories who had lost children to Mrs. Peterson's earlier crimes. They came seeking answers, closure, and sometimes just the chance to meet the young woman who had finally stopped the killer who had destroyed their lives. One such visitor was Mrs. Catherine Brennan from Montana Territory, whose 8-year-old son had disappeared 2 years earlier. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, her face bearing the permanent marks of grief, but her eyes holding something that might have been hope. Martha met with her in the sheriff's office, with her father providing translation as needed. Mrs. Brennan spoke slowly and clearly, making it easier for Martha to read her lips directly. "Miss Kellaway, I need to thank you for what you did. My boy Tommy was Mrs. Peterson's first victim in our town, and like here, she managed to convince everyone that a local simpleton was responsible. The poor man died in jail before the truth came out.
The weight of Mrs. Peterson's crimes continued to grow as more information emerged from other territories. The woman had been responsible for at least 23 deaths across 5 territories, perfecting her methods of deflection and deception with each community she destroyed. But Mrs. Brennan had not come only to express gratitude. She had a proposal that would change the course of Martha's life in ways she was only beginning to understand. There are other towns, other families dealing with similar situations, Mrs. Brennan continued. Children who are different, people who don't fit the normal patterns, communities that are quick to blame the vulnerable when bad things happen. You have skills and experience that could help them. Martha felt her father's attention sharpen beside her. The idea of leaving Cedar Ridge, of traveling to help other communities, was both thrilling and terrifying. She had only recently found her place in her hometown. The thought of venturing into unfamiliar territory to face similar challenges seemed overwhelming. But Mrs. Brennan was not finished. The territorial authorities are establishing a new position, a kind of traveling advocate for cases involving vulnerable populations. They want someone who understands what it's like to be different, someone who can't be intimidated or deceived by the kind of manipulation Mrs. Peterson used. Sheriff Kellaway's expression was carefully neutral, but Martha could see the conflict in his eyes. The father in him wanted to keep her safe and close, while the lawman in him recognized the value of what was being offered. Martha's hands moved slowly as she considered the proposal. The work would be dangerous, taking her into communities where fear and prejudice ran deep, where people like herself might be seen as threats rather than helpers. But it would also mean that other children might not suffer as Mrs. Peterson's victims had, that other vulnerable people might not face the kind of persecution she had endured. "I need time to think," Martha signed, and her father translated her words for Mrs. Brennan.
The older woman nodded understandingly. Of course. This isn't a decision to be made lightly, but I want you to know that there are people across the territories who are hoping you'll say yes. Your story has traveled far, Miss Kellaway. You've become a symbol of what's possible when someone refuses to be silenced.
After Mrs. Brennan left, Martha and her father sat in comfortable silence on the porch, each lost in their own thoughts. The evening air was warm for the first time since the previous autumn, and the sounds of normal life drifted from the town. Children playing, merchants closing their shops, families gathering for supper. "What are you thinking?" Sheriff Kellaway asked finally, his voice gentle but curious. Martha's response was complex, her hands painting a picture of conflicted emotions and competing desires. She had found peace and purpose in Cedar Ridge, had built relationships and discovered abilities she had never known she possessed. Leaving would mean abandoning the security of the familiar for the uncertainty of constant travel and new challenges.
But she had also learned that her silence, which had once been a source of vulnerability, could become a source of strength for others who found themselves voiceless in hostile environments. The skills she had developed in survival and observation, the empathy born of her own persecution, these were tools that could serve a broader purpose. "I'm scared," she admitted through her signing, "but I'm also angry. Angry that Mrs. Peterson was able to do what she did for so long because people were willing to look the other way as long as the blame fell on someone they already wanted to distrust." Her father nodded slowly. "And you think you can make a difference?"
Martha's hands moved with growing conviction as she signed her response. "I think I have to try. Mrs. Peterson chose me because she thought my condition made me weak, made me an easy target. If I can use that same condition to protect others who are being targeted the same way, then maybe her victims didn't die for nothing."
The decision, once articulated, felt inevitable. Martha would accept the territorial appointment and begin traveling to communities where her unique perspective and hard-won experience could help prevent other tragedies like the one that had nearly destroyed Cedar Ridge. But first, there was work to be done at home. The town's healing was incomplete, and Martha had promises to keep to the people who had supported her during the darkest days of suspicion and fear. Over the following weeks, she worked with Dr. Matthews to establish a permanent program for teaching communication skills to those who needed them. She helped Deputy Carson develop better procedures for investigating crimes involving vulnerable populations, ensuring that future sheriffs would not make the same mistakes that had nearly led to her destruction. Most importantly, she worked with the school board to create new policies protecting children who were different from their classmates. The memory of how quickly the town's children had turned against her, influenced by their parents' fears and prejudices, served as a powerful reminder that change had to begin with the youngest generation. The night before her departure, Martha stood once again in the cemetery, where Mrs. Peterson's victims lay buried. The headstones gleamed pale in the moonlight, silent testimony to the price of indifference and the cost of looking away when evil hid behind respectability. "I promise," Martha whispered, her voice a mere breath that only she could hear. It was the first time she had tried to speak aloud in 15 years, and though no sound emerged, the intention was clear and powerful. She would carry their memory with her, would let their loss give meaning to whatever good she might accomplish in the wider world. Sheriff Kellaway found her there as the church bell chimed midnight, marking the beginning of her last day in Cedar Ridge for what might be a very long time.
"Second thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her on the small bench that faced the children's graves.
Martha shook her head firmly. Her decision had been made, and her resolve had only strengthened as she prepared for the journey ahead. The territories were full of communities like Cedar Ridge, places where fear could quickly turn to hatred, where the vulnerable could become victims of their neighbors' prejudices as surely as they could become victims of actual criminals. "I'll write," she signed to her father. "Letters, reports, anything you want to know about where I am and what I'm doing." Sheriff Kellaway smiled sadly. "I know you will. And I'll be here when you need to come home, for however long or short a time that might be." They sat together in the peaceful darkness, father and daughter sharing a silence that was comfortable rather than empty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and unknown dangers, but tonight they had each other and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had faced evil together and emerged stronger for the experience. Martha's transformation from the sheriff's silent daughters, a voice for the voiceless, was complete, but her journey was just beginning. The territories stretched wide and wild beyond Cedar Ridge's borders, full of communities that might need her help and people who might benefit from her hard-won wisdom. The wind stirred the new leaves on the trees around the cemetery, carrying the scents of spring and the promise of renewal. Martha stood and touched each small headstone once more, a farewell to the children who had died, but whose memory would guide her steps in the years to come.
She was no longer afraid of her silence or ashamed of her difference. The sheriff's daughter had learned that true strength came not from fitting in, but from standing apart when standing apart was necessary to protect others. Her voice might remain silent, but her actions would speak volumes in the communities she served and the lives she touched. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, Martha prepared for her departure with the knowledge that she carried something precious with her. The understanding that being different was not a curse, but a gift. One that could illuminate the darkness for others who struggled to find their place in an often hostile world. The sheriff's daughter was riding out to serve justice in her own unique way, armed with silence that could hear what others missed, eyes that could see what others ignored, and a heart that had learned compassion through suffering. The territories would never be quite the same,